This year, GYSS celebrates its 10th anniversary of the annual meeting between young scientists and engineers from all over the world, and outstanding scientists and engineers who got Nobel Prize, field medals, Millennium Technology Prizes, and Turing Awards. Last year, besides the problem of COVID-19 pandemic, I had a severe accident, and so I could not join the event even online. This year I can be with you online, and I am allowed to send more Thai young scientists to the event than the previous years. Besides having the opportunity to learn from global scientists and engineers from other young scientists and the visits to research institute in Singapore, these young people who are mostly in science and technology careers can be inspired to create the works that benefit Thailand and the world. As they become successful professionals in science and technology, they will inspire other children to pursue the same careers, and the government could see the importance of promoting more citizens to study science and technology. I hope that young scientists and researchers in science and technology won't be discouraged by the obstacles they encounter and continue to do their best. I hope that they will always think of new things as GYSS moves on to the next 10 years.
It's 10 years of Global Young Scientists Summit, and it's my pleasure to congratulate Singapore's National Research Foundation and also the organizers for having Gyss this year, and I wish you a wonderful meeting. I'm very glad when I'm thinking of all the participants being the current or the former ones, because having exchange about science is one of the best things you can do. We in Lindau also had an anniversary last year, and of course it's always great to have this recognition for the past, but at the same time it gives much motivation and energy to carry on, particularly in times like these. Thinking of the young people, my message for you young scientists taking up a career in science and technology would be: do what you're really passionate about, be always curious and ready to share your knowledge, and a platform like the Global Young Scientists Summit is great for doing that. Sometimes I'm asked if I could get advice. I'm not within science, but my advice for further careers, of course with reference to a Nobel Prize, would be: despite all very obvious value in applied sciences, let's take COVID-19, do not lose sight of basic research, also for the sake of future generations. And now I hope you enjoy the Gyss 22 and wish you all the best for it. Many greetings from Lindau.
The success of the Global Young Scientists Summit is a testament to the importance of borderless collaboration in the pursuit of excellence and the benefit of humanity. As we seek to tackle global challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and protecting human health, and to pursue the knowledge of ourselves and the universe around us, this is the bedrock of future research, and it's your generation that will be at the forefront. The scale of these challenges may have inspired you all. I'm sure the desire to expand our understanding and make the world a better place will continue to inspire your generation. While the challenges are great, your generation, like those before you, stand on the shoulders of giants. You have access to new knowledge and tools that can help change the world for the better. I urge you all to grasp the opportunities and pursue your passions.
The Global Young Scientist Summit, GYSS, was established 10 years ago in order to excite, engage, and inspire young researchers to pursue their passion, develop solutions in order to solve problems in our economy and in society. This has never been more necessary. For example, COVID-19 has impacted all our lives, devastated many economies, changed our social habits. In addition, the world faces existential challenges, two of them, climate change and environmental sustainability. If we are to have any opportunity or any hope of overcoming these challenges, we need fresh minds to think up novel solutions, consider out-of-the-box avenues, and be able to put together a coherent program. What GYSS has done is to enable these young minds to collaborate together, exchange views, and form a community which will give us some advantage in overcoming these issues. GYSS has done well the last 10 years. I believe that GYSS will continue to do well and will continue to engage our young researchers and inspire them to do great things. Congratulations to GYSS on your 10th anniversary. I believe GYSS will continue to be relevant and will create new challenges and opportunities for all our young scientists and benefit the world and the scientific community. Congratulations.
He then did postdoctoral research on transposable elements with David Hogness at Stanford University before moving to Rockefeller in 1978. There, he used Drosophila to explore the molecular basis of circadian rhythms. Specifically, he identified clock genes that form a biochemical oscillator within the cells of our bodies, regulating sleep, arousal, and essential daily functions. Most of the Drosophila clock genes discovered by Prof. Yeoh and his colleagues are also central to the circadian pathways of vertebrates, including humans. Recently, his lab has shown that the prevalent human sleep disorder is caused by dysfunction in such a circadian clock gene. Prof. Yeoh's elected memberships include the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the President's Council of the New York Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Microbiology, and the Physiological Society London. Along with colleagues Jeffrey Hall and Michael Rosbach, he received many prestigious awards, including the 2009 Gruber Neuroscience Prize, 2011 Horwitz Prize, 2012 Canada Gairdner International Award, as well as Mastery Prize, 2013 Wiley Prize and Shaw Prize, and the 2017 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discoveries of molecular mechanisms that control circadian rhythms. Today, he will be presenting an exciting talk titled Chronic Social Isolation Signals Starvation in the Drosophila Brain and Reduces Sleep. Prof. Yeoh, please.
Thank you for that kind introduction. It's good to be with you. Sorry for the technical delays, but I'm pleased to be able to tell you what we've been learning about social isolation and neural responses to it in this model system that we've used so often in the past, that being Drosophila neurobiology and neurogenetics. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about some human data. Part of the reason we became interested in this problem and wanted to focus on Drosophila was because of work that had been published not very long ago by University College London, in which there was a study, a year-long study starting in March of 2020, just as the pandemic was beginning. And it's a study of about 70,000 UK respondents, and the respondents were asked to rate their sleep over the course of a year periodically. On a 5-point scale, very good sleep was given a high rating, and very poor sleep a low rating, a 1 versus a 5, for example. And what you notice in this graph going from March of 2020 to March of 2021 is a slow erosion of the perception of the quality of sleep by this large cohort of individuals in the United Kingdom. And it was true for both females and males. And of course, you can see the timing of many of the lockdowns in the UK over that period of time. So it's quite clear that sleep has eroded, the quality of sleep has eroded over that year-long period. And of course, the stresses and strains are many, which are related to responses to COVID, but one of the major components of that stress is social isolation. Now, we can't really measure how much of this response is due to a response to social isolation having a direct effect on sleep in human individuals, but we can ask the same kind of question in a model organism, and again, that would be Drosophila. So we've tried to ask in Drosophila whether Drosophila respond to social isolation, and if so, if one of the responses to social isolation involves their quality of sleep. Now, in Drosophila, as you see over here on the right, we often use a fairly simple monitoring system, which we refer to as a Drosophila activity monitor on the right side of your screen. And the idea is that flies are loaded into individual tubes, one fly per tube, enough fly food, solid fly food at one end of the tube to keep these flies alive for several days or even a couple of weeks. And these tubes are placed in monitors, of which we have hundreds. Within those monitors, there is an infrared beam produced by an LED that is followed with a series of phototransistors that indicate when beam breaks occur, which are indicators of the movement of the flies within these tubes. All of that digital data is collected by a computer. And over here on the left side of the screen, we see that this is turned into a readout in which we can see the individual behaviors of many, many flies. Here we have a stack of about 20 flies, each being recorded over a 24-hour period. Daytime is indicated as 0 to 12 in the light open bar. The dark bar indicates nighttime when the lights are off. And what you see is each fly is showing a pattern of behavior that is largely shared by all the flies in the group displayed here. So flies are fairly active in the morning. They have a noon or a midday nap, which is extensive. They become active again toward the end of the day, and then they show consolidated rest, consolidated sleep at night. And this can be transformed into another representation here, showing sleep amounts varying across the day and night. So this is the way we can measure sleep and activity in the flies, and then ask questions about behavioral stresses. So again, our question is, does social isolation reduce sleep in Drosophila? And the way we approached that was to take a bottle of flies in which we have dozens of flies together for 3 to 5 days to give them the acquisition of social experience. And then we remove the flies from those bottles and put them either 1 fly per tube, 2 flies per tube, 5 flies per vial, 25 or 100 flies per vial. And we hold them in that situation for a total of 7 days and then record their sleep-wake behavior using the activity monitor as I described previously. What we find is there is an erosion of sleep in the individuals that are in isolation, that is, where we have a single fly in a single vial. We find that significantly diminishes sleep, primarily daytime sleep, but surprisingly, even 2 flies in a vial eliminates this issue. 2 flies, 5 flies, 25, and 100 flies are indistinguishable with regard to the level of sleep that they maintain. It's just the single fly that's showing this diminished sleep response to social isolation. A second question we wanted to ask is whether social isolation is perceived over time. Is it isolation duration dependent? To do that experiment, again, we gave the flies an opportunity for several days of social experience, and then moved them to vials in which we either had 25 flies or a single fly in isolation. And then we maintained flies in that configuration for either 1 day, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, and looked after each of those durations at their sleep-wake behavior using the Drosophila activity monitor. What we found was that there was a progressive loss of sleep, primarily daytime sleep, that arose as the flies were isolated for longer and longer periods of time relative to the group-reared flies. Importantly, we saw this response not just in a limited number of strains of flies, but we saw it in many Drosophila species, every species we tested, many isogenic strains, young versus old flies, and in several sleep inbred panel lines. These are panels of flies that were recovered from the field. They're wild caught flies, but in establishing inbred lines, we find that they can have longer or shorter duration total sleep over 24 hours. And in every case, whether they were long or short sleepers, they behaved in the way shown here, social isolation having profound effect on the amount of sleep when it becomes chronic, that is 7 or more days. This just breaks down the information a little more extensively. For example, total sleep continuously erodes over 7 days. Daytime sleep, as I pointed out, erodes more severely over those 7 days. And especially sleep occurring in the first few hours, the first 4 hours after dawn, that's where we see the greatest amount of sleep. So this is the early portion of the midday nap that the flies are having. This seems to be the most robustly affected by social isolation. Now, we've asked whether there are tricks that we can perform to try to relieve this social isolation. For example, if we take a single fly and put it into a vial where previously many flies have been reared, presumably there would be odors left over, chemical cues left over in that vial from the prior rearing of a number of flies in that vial. But this has no effect on the level of sleep loss compared to a single fly in isolation for 7 days. We've also inserted a glass slide in the middle of one of these vials where we have a number of flies on one side of the slide, a single fly on the other. So the lonely fly, we'll call it, can see the other flies but can't touch or smell them. That fly still acts with respect to sleep as if it's lonely. If we have a perforated separator so that the animals are able to smell the live flies on the other side and see them, that also, if anything, exacerbates the sleep problem. Even a little more sleep seems to be lost under those conditions. And if we use a still more permeable filter between the group and the lone fly, we also get, if anything, a diminution of the amount of sleep versus a lone fly, indicating that it's not just being isolated, but perhaps the feeling of not being able to join a group. This sleep loss is relieved by allowing another species of fly. If we add numbers of a small number of flies of a different species, Drosophila of a different species, this will relieve the sleep problem from the lone Drosophila melanogaster. And we get a variable response from adding other kinds of pets, if you will. 2 different strains of ladybugs. One strain seems to have no effect, but the other strain seems to improve things. So this needs to be investigated more closely. Other kinds of insects can have either no effect or a further diminution in the responses to isolation. So we have a number of questions that we have that arise from these kinds of experiments about what is being perceived here by that lone isolated fly. Now, we're most interested in the neural responses. What in the brain is responsible for these responses? This is something that we certainly can't ask about. We don't have the tools to ask about this in humans, but in flies, we have many tools to more deeply investigate the neural basis for these stress responses associated with social isolation. We reasoned that since most of the sleep lost is in the early part of the midday nap, that if we looked using RNA-seq for RNA changes, gene expression changes that were occurring immediately preceding that part of the midday nap, in group reared flies, chronically isolated flies, or in acutely isolated flies, that meaning flies that were isolated for just a single day, that perhaps we could compare the gene expression patterns found in those 3 groups and determine if there are genetic gene expression changes that are unique to these chronically isolated flies. So we compared the chronically isolated flies to group-reared flies, and the isolated 7-day isolated flies, chronically isolated flies, to single day of isolation, and look for something that was unique to the chronically isolated flies. We found 274 genes that fit that pattern. Now, when we ask what's the nature of the genes that are affected in these gene expression assays, we're interested in two kinds of changes. We're interested in changes that occur in the chronically isolated flies, the 7-day isolated flies, that differ from both the group and the 1-day isolates, where they look about the same, but we have a strong diminution in expression in the chronically isolated flies, or alternatively, where we have a strong induction of new gene expression uniquely in the chronically isolated flies. And when we put these two groups together and do GO analysis, gene ontology analysis, to find out what kinds of genes are being regulated or now misregulated by social isolation, we find that most of the responses, the most significant responses we get by GO class, involve metabolism, involve genes that are involved in the metabolism of the fly. Now, if we look further and say what are the most robustly changing gene patterns in the family, we have a list of top 20 changes, most of which are upregulations in the genes shown here. There's one exception, a downregulation, which is for a gene called Drosophila. This is a gene that produces a hormone that responds to satiety. When the animal is no longer hungry, this hormone goes up. And what you can see here is the hormone is reduced following social isolation. Up here, we have a gene called Lumistatin, which we know is an appetite-stimulating hormone. This is upregulated in these socially isolated flies. On the right, you see a series of arrows, and those arrows point to genes that were previously identified in a study of gene responses to 24 hours of starvation. So what we see here is a pattern emerging from social isolation that resembles that of a starving Drosophila brain. Quite a surprise to us since we began by studying sleep. So given that gene expression pattern, we wanted to know if behaviorally, in addition to affecting sleep, social isolation was affecting feeding in these flies. Now, to do this, we required a new device, something called an activity recording capillary feeder, or ARC for short. And in this setup, we have a fly in a tube. 3 tubes are shown here with flies in them. And in each tube is a capillary in which liquid food is placed. And what we now have is video monitoring of both the activity of the flies and the position of the meniscus on that liquid feeding tube. So as the meniscus moves, we can measure feeding, and as the fly moves, we're measuring sleep versus wakefulness. And on the right, what we see is what happens in the sleep profile and in the feeding profile. And you'll notice that once again, sleep is lost in the chronically isolated flies. And here what we find is feeding is enhanced, is accelerated, is upregulated in the chronically socially isolated animals. And this is more of a quantitative analysis of the same experiments for total sleep, for daytime sleep, nighttime sleep, and again, ZT 0 to 4 hour sleep, that early morning sleep. What we see is essentially the same response, the same loss of sleep at each of these episodes that we showed with the other style activity monitor. But now if we look at feeding, we see total food consumption, daily food consumption, nighttime food consumption, and early morning food consumption. And all of these are significantly upregulated. That is, the amount of feeding that we see, the amount of food consumed at all of these times is about twice that we would see in group-reared flies. So there's a profound effect on the amount of food intake by flies that are socially isolated. So they're losing sleep, and they're eating more. Now, this is reminiscent of a recently published article by the American Psychological Association. This covered a year of the pandemic, essentially the same year that I spoke about in the University College London study. And the summary of this study is that 6 in 10, about 60% of American adults have either lost or gained weight that was unwanted over the period of the pandemic. Now, weight gains are shown on the right in red, weight losses are shown on the left, and what's clear is that most individuals whose weight is changing, these are weight gains rather than weight losses. It's about 2/3 to 3/4 of the population of weight changes are in the gain category. And you see from the types of individuals that have been looked at that this is pretty uniform across all segments of the population, and the size of the weight gains is really startling. 30, 40 pounds gained in a single year, for example, in many of these individuals. That's an average weight gain in many of these individuals. So in many ways, our model organism Drosophila is doing very much what many of us have been doing over the course of the pandemic when chronically isolated. I want to go back for a couple of minutes and cover, once again, look at some of the genes that were strongly misregulated by social isolation. And I want to focus on lumistatin, which again is a starvation-induced hormone, as I mentioned before. This is a hormone that previously we did not know was expressed in the brain. It had previously been shown to be produced in the corpora cardiaca, which is outside the head. It's part of the thorax. And so we decided that we would use immunocytochemistry to see if we could locate the cells that must be giving this lumistatin signal in the brain of our socially isolated flies. And what we found is there is a lumistatin signal in the central brain. This is antibody to lumistatin, and it involves a structure called the fan-shaped body, which is in the central brain, the central complex of the brain, and is has been previously associated with a number of behavioral functions ranging from orientation, learning and memory, and sleep regulation. So lumistatin is produced in these cells. The cell bodies fall outside the fan-shaped bodies, but their projections go to the fan-shaped body, to a layer in the fan-shaped body. And importantly, what is shown here are signals from GFP that are driven by a reporter, by a driver and reporter system, which we call P2. These are P2 neurons that are lighting up here. Their projections are lighting up here. P2 neurons had previously been associated with a center of the brain that was responsible for regulating sleep. So importantly, if we merge these images, we see that there's a strong overlap in the projections of both of these neurons, that the P2 neurons and the lumistat expressing neurons are closely mingled in their projections. And moreover, the connectome that has been produced at Genalia, or Hughes Genalia Research Center, have recently shown that there are extensive synaptic connections between these two groups of projections in the fan-shaped body. So we know from the connectome analysis that these cells are capable of interacting with one another synaptically. We've asked what happens if we suppress the activity of the P2 neurons. Can we block, for example, the response to social isolation of reduced sleep? What's shown over here on the right is a driver driving in P2's neurons a potassium channel called KIR2, which when expressed will cause a neuron to become inactive, no longer electrically active. When that is expressed in P2 neurons, what we see is that the 7 days of isolation no longer has an impact on the sleep of the fly. The controls of the 2 parental strains that were used to make these flies, which don't themselves express the necessary combination to inactivate the P2 neurons. So inactivation of P2 neurons will suppress this response to social isolation. It will also repress the feeding response to social isolation. So here are the controls showing the overeating of chronically isolated Drosophila, and down here the suppression, the same suppression of those P2 neurons in these individuals brings these closely aligned with one another. So we've essentially removed the effect of social isolation on appetite. We were also interested in what might happen if we activate the same neurons. Is it sufficient to activate these neurons to get a stress response in the fly that is comparable to that produced by chronic social isolation? And I just want you to focus on this bottom corner here. What we've done is we've expressed a temperature responsive cation channel called TRPA1. When exposed to 28 degrees, a warm temperature, that channel opens, and that will cause neurons with that channel to become active. At 22 degrees, the channel is inactive. What you can see is at 22 degrees, group reared flies and flies isolated for a single day both show the same response, which is in a lack of the activation of that channel. In contrast, when we activate the channel, either in group or isolated flies, only the flies showing a single day of isolation show a response that indicates that they now are feeling chronically isolated. There's a diminution in sleep in response to activating those neurons, but only if they've seen a day of social isolation. The group-reared flies don't do this. We get the same response with feeding at 22 degrees. Group-reared and isolated, one-day isolated flies are the same. However, when we raise the temperature to activate those channels, one-day group and one-day isolation, those now differ, with a day of isolation producing the overeating phenotype that we saw previously. So activating these neurons can produce a phenotype resembling chronic social isolation, but only if the flies have at least experienced a day of social isolation. So it somehow makes them miscalculate or misperceive the duration of their social isolation. Now, once again, I just want to point out that there's a convergence of neuronal projections from Lumistatin-producing neurons and sleep-promoting neurons. R23E10 is a driver that activates neurons in the central brain that are known to be sleep-promoting neurons. And here we're looking at anti-Lumistatin, anti-R23E10 or GFP. And now when we merge them, we see that they are in close contact with one another. And as I said previously, these neurons from the connectome analyses that have been performed are extensively synapsed to one another. So we think there's a direct interaction between the feeding and sleep neurons in this discrete region of the brain. So let me just finish by drawing some conclusions. Drosophila can distinguish between acute and chronic social isolation. Chronic social isolation activates central brain neurons that regulate appetite. Increased feeding, or the starvation brain state, induced by chronic isolation appears to broadly reset gene expression programs that are associated with metabolism. Again, that was a surprise when we first saw that. The drive to feed may inhibit sleep. Of course, if you must eat, you can't sleep, and if you must sleep, you can't eat. You could imagine that those two things could have an impact of one another. Nevertheless, the axonal projections of previously documented sleep-promoting neurons are extensively synapsed with projections of the P2 neurons that are involved in this response to social isolation. So we feel there can be a much more hardwired regulation of this balance between sleeping, gain of appetite, and loss of sleep. Finally, hyperactivity of P2 neurons alters the duration of social isolation needed to reduce sleep. And this suggests to us that the P2 neurons somehow encode a time-dependent isolation status. So I'll just finish by pointing out the people that did this work. This is a party we had a few years ago in Sweden. This is Wan-He Lee, who is the principal scientist on this work in the lab. And she was a postdoc in the lab. She's recently become an assistant professor at Texas A&M University. And Zikun Weng, formerly a graduate student in the laboratory, also very much responsible for the work done on this project. Thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for the very engaging talk. I don't see any questions at the moment. Let me know if I'm mistaken, but I can start with one to get the ball rolling. So basically, it seems that isolation might induce this kind of a state of stress in the animal. That could be one hypothesis. And are there other studies from your lab or other labs which look at the effect of, for example, acute versus chronic stressors, perhaps shock or some other kind of stressor on sleep and appetite, and whether that's mediated by similar or different mechanisms?
Right. That's an important issue that we need to address in the future. It's related to a question that we're addressing now, which is, does social isolation, are these neurons that we've discovered, is there activity necessary for the perception of the stress of social isolation? Are they no longer stressed? And that's why we no longer, when we inactivate those neurons, is that why we're no longer losing sleep and no longer overeating? Or are we simply blunting, or the animal's still feeling stressed, still perceiving their isolation, still stressed, but unable to respond appropriately or in this fashion to that stress? And so one of the things that we're doing in that case is to look at other responses to social isolation. So for example, one of the responses that we're aware of is aggression. So social isolation increases the aggression of flies. And so we're interested in understanding whether those aggressive responses, the responses of aggression, are also linked to the P2 neuron set, for example. Again, the idea being that if everything, and there are other responses that we can look at as well, and the question we have in mind is, if a whole series of different responses to social isolation are all eliminated by suppressing P2 activity, then this begins to sound to us much more like the animal's not perceiving the stress anymore, or not perceiving it in the same way. So this is sort of the first step in that kind of a direction. You've asked about whether there could be other stressors that show up chronically, and we haven't gone down that road yet. We thought social isolation is a form of stress that's easily provided without producing, on the face of it, important physical damage to the fly, like, for example, concussion or some kind of a shock treatment, as you'd mentioned. But we could certainly go in that direction in the future.
Right, thanks a lot. I see more questions now. So one is from Lockye Louise Choi. Some has suggested the contribution of metabolic problems to the development of cancer. Sorry, you have to scroll back again. Given social isolation will alter metabolism, will this in turn contribute to cancer development? Or could this?
Yeah, and of course we don't know yet, since these studies are fairly early on. We're just getting the first look at what's going on. But certainly, if we look at human populations in the response to unwanted weight gain, we know that diabetes, for example, is associated with unwanted weight gain, and that there are interactions between diabetes and predictions of the incidence of certain forms of cancer. But these are all important questions to ask, but we don't have any more along those lines in the fly. But again, we can point to the expectation that if the fly is in fact a good model for what goes on in humans following social isolation, that there could be a variety of metabolic responses that are contrary to good health.
Great. And there's another related question by Leo Chan, very interesting as well. Are there changes to microbiome composition and activities due to isolation-induced sleep disruptions, or maybe due to isolation in general, which then might exert these neuronal changes through this gut-brain axis?
Yeah, we're asking that question now. The same question has arisen in the principal scientists that have been doing this work, and we don't know the answer yet. But I think it will be interesting on two levels. Our first pass is just to ask, in the whole fly, are there any changes in commensal organisms that we see in response to social isolation, whether they're in the digestive system or elsewhere? It's quite possible that there's a change in the load of microbiota all over the animal. So it'll be very interesting to see if there are changes and where those changes are. And we certainly haven't excluded the possibility that there could be changes outside the digestive system that are important, in spite of the fact that appetite changes do suggest a careful look at what's going on in the digestive system. So hopefully in a year's time, we'll know much more about that.
Right, I can probably take a few more questions. Which ones? Okay, there's a top voted question by Sunmina. Are the effects of chronic social isolation on the brain and metabolism reversible upon regrouping the flies? Basically, can you rescue these effects? Yeah.
Yes, it seems like you can suppress these rather quickly by moving a lonely fly back into a group. So they are reversible, although one of the concerns about a pandemic, for example, is that we're talking about 1 or 2 years of impact versus 7 days of impact. And of course, you could say, well, 7 days out of the life of a fly might be comparable to 1 or 2 years in a human life. But it does suggest that for flies and for humans, that these should be reversible changes.
Yes, and another very interesting question. So these flies were previously social flies. They were previously exposed to social cues. So Tingwei is asking what happens if they were isolated from birth, I guess, all the way through. Then are there similar or different effects? Yeah.
Yeah, we don't know that yet. The way we would like to do that is by collecting fertilized eggs and raising them throughout their early development by themselves, so that they never see another fly, and then asking what the whether isolation of that sort produces a different effect. And of course, the control for that would be to have a group of embryos that are put together in a comparable vial, let them grow up at the same in the same time frame, and see if there are differences in behavior of the sort that we've seen in the experiment so far. But it's an interesting problem that we're anxious to follow up on.
Yep. Well, the last question is, well, the one on the chat is similar to what has been asked before, so I don't think I'm going to ask that, but I guess, is there any more? Okay, there is a pointed question. To what extent can these findings be extended to humans? And
Well, we don't know, but it certainly suggests that, Drosophila has been a great model for many areas of human biology. For example, we have a long history of working on circadian rhythms and the genes and proteins involved. And those genes and proteins that were originally found in Drosophila allowed us to bootstrap into mice and humans. And it's essentially the same mechanism in us for circadian rhythmicity as it is for Drosophila. So we use Drosophila to give us ideas about how and where to look, what kinds of changes may be occurring, and then it makes it much easier down the road. I think you wouldn't immediately jump to humans, but you might ask whether or not similar centers of regulation, similar changes in appetite and sleep occur in a mammalian model. Mice, for example, which are so easily really genetically worked with. But certainly, as I showed you, we've got large numbers of observational studies, large numbers of individuals in observational studies, human observational studies that indicate weight gains and lost sleep over the course of the pandemic. And I suspect that social isolation is an important player in those responses.
I agree. I study the zebrafish, and we also see effects of isolation on various kinds of behaviors. So, and to get my 2 cents worth is, I think anything important in biology is probably going to be very well conserved across many different species. So I think we can wrap this up right now. So thank you so much, Prof. Yeoh, for this very engaging talk. And hope to see you in person one day. And thank you all for coming.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Good morning, friends and participants of the Global Young Scientists Summit 2022. Welcome to the panel discussion on the next generation grid. My name is Yeoh Weng, and I'll be the host today. This year, the summit attracted a record number of participants of 1,600 from 38 countries. And today we have about 300 participants joining this online panel today. So we all know that climate change has posed an existential threat to us. And the power sector is one of the biggest contribution of global greenhouse gas. So there's a need for us to then to transform our power grid into a modern grid so as to be able to take in a lot more renewable and green energy. And today, this morning, we have three eminent speakers to share with us their insight on the future, the next generation grid. So first we have Professor Jayant Baliga. He's a distinguished energy university professor from North Carolina State University. And Professor Baliga is also the recipient of IEEE Medal of Honor in 2014. Next, we have Professor Stanley Whittingham, a Sunny Distinguished Professor of Chemistry and Material and Engineering at Binghamton University. Professor Whittingham is also the 2019 Chemistry Nobel laureate. Last but not least, Professor Rong Hui, MediaTek Endowed Professor and Chair of Power Electronics at the Nanyang Technological University. He is also the recipient of the 2015 IEEE Technical Field Award in Power Electronics and the 2010 IET Compton Model. So to the panelists, thank you for agreeing to be on our panel discussion today. So I will call upon each of them to give a 5-minute in sharing on their area and also on the insight of the next generation grid. So may I invite Professor Jayant Baliga to share his insight first. Professor Baliga, over to you.
So good morning to all the participants. Could the organizers put up the slides I sent you? Is that possible? Very good. So stay on the first slide, please. So what I'd like to do in my 5 minutes is to tell you that at North Carolina State University, we've actually been working on the power grid for about 15 years. And one of our major programs here was sponsored by the National Science Foundation. It was a $50 million program that ran for 10 years, and it involved 5 universities across the country. And our goal was to create what we call the future renewable electrical energy distribution and management system, or a freedom system. And our concept was to create what we call a plug-and-play microgrid architecture. So to give you an analogy, where we often use our flash drives, the sticks that you put into the computer, and they work seamlessly, they get powered, they exchange information, and so on. So that is done, of course, with signal level processing. What we wanted to do is create a similar architecture for very high power levels. And the reason is that today a consumer cannot plug in a solar panel into the power grid or even energy storage device. The utilities will not allow that because it creates instabilities and difficulties for them. So the key component that we came up with to allow us to do this is known as the solid state transformer. That's written on the upper left corner of this chart. And I'll talk more about this. But that is a very smart semiconductor-based transformer, unlike the present transformers made of copper and iron. So with this transformer, we can control the voltages and currents very precisely, and it is something that enables preventing any instabilities. So I'll tell you a little bit about this solid-state transformer concept and what we have done to make it successful. But we realized that to create a successful microgrid, we also need it to be reliable and safe from faults in the system. For example, a storm might come and a tree limb might fall across the power line somewhere in the microgrid and create a problem. So we want to isolate such faults, and to do that, we created what's called a fault isolation device. So these devices we felt had to be made with new semiconductor material, not silicon. Silicon is very good for many things, but not for this kind of voltage and power level. So we worked on silicon carbide and gallium nitride power devices. So the next slide gives you a little more about this. It shows here in the diagram the solid state transformer.
We lost him. We lost Professor Baliga. Okay, so perhaps we should invite Professor Whittingham to share his insight first. Professor Whittingham, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm not using any slides, so let's see how it goes. So I want to really talk about lithium-ion batteries, what they can do to help the grid, but it's perhaps good to remember the lithium-ion batteries really enable the communications revolution. So they provide the storage for that, so everyone has one or two of the lithium-ion batteries with them. And really, if we're going to solve climate change, clearly we have to adapt ourselves, but we also need to reduce the amount of temperature increase. We'll have to use cleaner fuels, which means we're going to be using probably renewables such as wind and solar. Those are both intermittent. So we will need storage. The largest storage by far is pumped hydro, but that's not portable and not available in many places. So we need, in particular, batteries. And right now, lithium-ion batteries are dominating the energy storage arena. If you think about the largest one, which is, I think, is now 1.6 gigawatt hours, it's in California, just south of San Francisco. It's operating well, and I understand is financially viable. So grid storage that works there. The other areas clearly where batteries are going are into electric vehicles, and there's now renewed in what we can call a 1,000,000-mile battery. This would enable your vehicle, whether it's a truck or a car, to be permanently connected to the grid, except when you're actually driving. So it would act as a buffer on the grid and maybe help your home at the same time.
Okay.
But the challenge we have, it takes 50 to 80 kilowatt hours of energy to make a 1 kilowatt hour battery. So we have to change that. Part of that problem there is the materials may go 20 to 50,000 miles from the mine to the finished product, which is not sustainable. So the challenge we really face is to build what we'll call more localized supply chains. So these are maybe in, say, the Americas or in Europe. Asia obviously is doing very well there. So we have to work hard on that and enable trained people to spread around the world to do it, because outside of Asia, there's not enough workforce knowledge either in battery manufacturing or in the supply chain itself. So we have to work on that. And that, as I mentioned to, I think somebody else earlier this week, Singapore would be a great place to go all electric. You're an island state. I don't think people drive all that far or not very often. You could easily ban most internal combustion engines within the next 10 to 20 years and only sell electric vehicles. So I think now Singapore has a good chance for doing this. Clearly, this all impacts the grid. You need a better grid if you're going to have large amounts of electric vehicles and storage for other devices on it. And we just need to make it happen now, one way or another. So we're going to have to adapt to climate change. We're going to have to adapt to doing things the new ways. And clearly a lot of politicians won't want to do that. But I think we have to move forward. And there's places like Singapore, I think, that can make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, okay, we got Professor Jan Baliga back. We'll give you an opportunity to continue your discussion later. Now I call upon Professor Ron Hui to share his insight.
Yeah, I think in order to drastically reduce greenhouse gas, we need to proportionally increase wind and solar power or other renewable energy generation. But for the power system to be stable, the emerging smart grid need to balance supply and demand in real time. So in this slide, you can see if we separate the power supply into two groups, the stable power generation are the traditional generators, nuclear power plant, etc. If we want to increase renewable energy sources like wind and solar power, somehow we need to change our control paradigm. Now we have a golden opportunity because globally, many governments have decided to increase the adoption of electric vehicles. And we know electric vehicles have batteries. So what we are considering now is the combined use of solid-state transformer, connecting the grid and a large-scale EV charging infrastructure so that we can utilize all the batteries in the electric vehicle, as well as second life battery that we anticipate to be available in a few years' time when people replace their electric vehicle. And that become a new opportunity for us to use the load, the battery, to absorb the power fluctuation of wind and solar power. In this way, the adoption of electric vehicle and the adoption of renewable energy can grow together simultaneously. So this will become a win-win situation. Now, how can we massively deploy this idea in a city like Singapore? Let me show you this diagram. In Singapore, we have over 1,000 multi-story car parks. And on average, if we talk about 1,000 parking spaces in each multi-story car park, for a 20 kilowatt charger, we have a 20 megawatt load in each building. So we will incorporate a new concept to the solid-state transformer called electric spring concept. The spring will give us the function to absorb and deliver power in order to balance the supply and demand. That means the spring will be the tool for us to tame the intermittency of renewable energy. So if we have 1,000 multi-story car park distributed in the grid in the city, so it will behave like the array of mechanical springs supporting the mattress. That will become a highly robust and stable power grid. And that will allow us to drastically increase wind and solar power. And from our preliminary study, we hope we can increase renewable energy up to 30 to 40%. Now, in a global sense, that can be translated to about 20% of global reduction in greenhouse gas emission. So this will be a proposal that we would explore in Singapore in the next few years. I think that will be my sharing.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hui. So now we go to our panel discussion, and just to set the theme of the discussion right, I would like to ask each of the panelists to share your view on how you define the next generation grid, and also what do you think the next generation grid will look like? Would it be a distributed architecture? Will you see the blurring of line between the consumer and producer? So I would like each of you to share your view. We start with Professor Baliga, please.
Thank you. So I think I already started off by describing what we proposed at NC State to NSF in the United States. And that's the concept of the microgrid, where it becomes a self-sustaining grid at a smaller scale, which integrates the energy generation through wind or solar, the energy storage, and the users, which are consumers or industries. And to do that, we felt two things are needed that I was describing. One is the solid state transformer to be able to plug and disconnect all these energy storage or energy generation units into and out of the grid. And the other was the fault isolation devices that would isolate any faults in the grid and keep the rest of the grid working. That gives you a lot of resiliency and robustness. So to do all of this, it took 10 years of work, and we realized that it's not just the power electronics that's needed. A lot of communication is needed across the grid to balance everything. So a lot of communication work was done, and a lot of software protocols were also done in order to make this work. So it was a very big effort with 5 universities and 10 years of effort. So what I wanted to convey is this gave a chance for us to establish a methodology to achieve what we're talking about. It's not a completely new idea anymore. There's a lot of work that's been done here, and then we've seen activities like this in Germany and many other places as well. So I think we have a very good place to start if we want to seriously implement these kinds of new types of grids. I can tell you that the biggest challenge I think we are going to face is that the utilities are not ready to accept this kind of a concept. It challenges their traditional architecture, which is to generate power at a large scale and send it over a long distance. And this is not the model that they want to see, where they lose control of the generation, of course, and the revenue that comes from it. So as a consequence, the people who make the devices also don't see a market, because nobody is asking them to sell these devices into the utilities. So this is somewhat of a chicken and egg problem. And I think this is making the current semiconductor industry in the power area very reluctant to get into the utility scale work. Instead, you mentioned the electric car already. So they are very heavily investing in making devices for the electric vehicle, because there's clearly a big, huge market for it. And they are seeing very good reaction to products that they're making. So in some senses, we are working along the lines you mentioned, but in terms of the actual grid itself, that activity is not moving as fast as I'd like to see.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I think the challenge will be to get the utility to accept all this new technology. And I also see that silicon carbide transformer would be one of the game changer in this new grid. Yeah, so let's hear from Professor Whittingham.
So I agree with mostly what Jay said. I look at the next generation grid as really a lot of micro grids connected together, so they're interconnected. And the challenges we then face is we need storage for doing the smoothing, but also a lot of the generation comes from large sources in New York State. We get a lot of our power from hydropower from Quebec. So our plans now building huge wind farms off the coast of Long Island. And all that will then have to be transmitted throughout the state and basically throughout the Northeast. But complicating all that is, as you said, is the utilities. In a state like New York, I think we have 4 or 5 different utilities. It's not clear that they can generate power and necessarily sell that power. So when they put storage in, to them, it's not clear how they can make any money from storage because it's not considered a generation capacity. But there are third parties coming in already on storage. They're building storage facilities next to substations, and they buy the power at night and sell it back to the grid in the middle of the day when they need it. So it's happening here. Clearly, it's happening in California. The huge facility in Moss Landing, it basically getting charged with excess solar energy in the middle of the day. Right now, California is generating too much solar, and then they're using it later in the day. So I think we're going to have microgrids, which help us get over some of the things like when we have hurricanes and tornadoes, which can disrupt the major grids. Your little self-contained grid will then still survive those outside activities. So it'll give us more flexibility. It'll hopefully allow things to keep going. But I think the other key thing in the long term is we're going to link all our storage capabilities together, which includes the cars, the trucks, everything. But we've got to get the car makers not to void the warranties if we do that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So you sort of extended to say that the future grid is going to be a mesh of microgrid, and
Yes.
so and because we have to put all our clean energy on it, and most of them are intermittent, so battery storage as to sort of buffer the intermittency would be something that is important. I have a question from the audience now, directed to Professor Whittingham, and I would like to ask him to ask the question directly. We have this from Olivier Hervier. Do we want to put him on so that he can ask a question on the new batteries?
Hi,
Okay,
panel.
he's
It's been an
online
absolute
now.
pleasure listening. Hi, panel. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to you all today. I just wanted your opinion on other types of batteries and to what extent you think new batteries that are currently being developed, like dual carbon batteries or other things like that, will be important for the future. And what, if any, type of battery you think might overtake lithium-ion batteries in the future, given that there are some issues with production and lithium abundance?
Something will take over from lithium ion, but I don't think within the next 10 years. Lithium ion's made in the billions today. Any new technology will have to come in and have a niche market where they can make some money to begin with before they can compete economically. And what's surprising about the grid storage, they're using the expensive layered oxides predominantly on the grid because of weight and space issues, whereas they should be using, in my mind, lithium iron phosphate, which is lower cost, safer, and so on. But I think it's going to be a while before any other technology can knock that. The big advantage of lithium ion, they can put it in trailers, utilities can move it around as they like, and you don't need anybody to look after it. So the facilities I know, somebody sits in an office maybe 100 miles away and just monitors it. And they made a facetious comment where I said, how much work do you have to do to keep this up? Well, we have to go and mow the grass around the facility once a week. And that's it. Basically, don't need any maintenance. And most of these flow systems will need a professional on site to look after them, I think.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. Professor Whittingham, I actually have a follow-on question. And Recently, I read that Form Energy has got funding from the Department of Energy, and they are looking at iron air battery, and they claim that it's going to be 1/10 of the price and 10 times the duration compared to lithium battery. What's your opinion on that?
I would say 90% of what you read on batteries is hype. So be very careful. There's no way they can do it for that cutting cost. One of the major components in the battery is the copper. You got all your buzz bars, connections, everything else, and the substructure outside the active components is a significant part of the cost. So I think as people eliminate the cobalt and other things, the price will keep coming down. Right now, the auto companies are buying batteries at $100 a kilowatt hour. The goal of DOE is maybe $50 kilowatt hour, the pack level for long storage on the grid. But what the grid folks want, they want it to last 20 years. If it's going to last 20 years, it's not going to be low cost.
Okay, thank you. So I would invite Professor Ron Hui to talk about how you define the grid of the future.
Okay, I think there are a few distinctive features of the emerging grid. First, I think we will see more distributed power generation. In the traditional sense, we have the centralized power generation, but we are migrating to distributed one with more wind and solar power. The second feature will be a change of control paradigm. Traditionally, we have the power supply following the load demand. But with all this distributed power generation, the power company has no way to get all information instantaneously to know how much power generation we have. So we have to change the control paradigm that it will be the low demand to follow the power generation. And this will be the only way we can balance supply and demand and increase the use of renewable energy penetration in our emerging power system.
Thank you. Okay, so we have another question from the audience. This is from Makima. I will invite him to come online to ask the question. Makima, please. Okay.
Hello, my name is Makima. I'm come from Thailand. My question is, in the future, can all the electrical that we use in daily lives come from renewable energy, and how much energy storage that need to support this situation, and why in present the main energy isn't come from the renewable energy? What is the main problem now?
Okay, I'll invite Professor Ron Hui to take that question.
At the moment, we noticed that when the renewable energy penetration reach about 15 to 17%, the power system become unstable because of the intermittency of wind and solar power. So that's why we need a lot of energy storage like battery to buffer this fluctuation. Now, I believe that we still need some traditional power generation because renewable energy is to some extent quite unpredictable. So wind and solar energy is not a reliable source. So we still need some traditional power generation. But with the storage, with clever control of different clusters of microgrid, we may be able to push the penetration of renewable energy up to 30 or 40%. Now, even 30 to 40% globally, it means that we can reduce CO2 emission by around 20% globally. And that is a huge impact in slowing down the climate change.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I would like to follow on for this question for Professor Ron Hui. So from 2001 to 2019, we realized that the solar cost has actually reduced by 89%, and wind reduced by 70%. So what do you think will be the dominant renewable energy for the grid?
I think it depends on the location. For Singapore, for example, we have to rely on solar energy because we don't have a lot of wind resources. But in Europe, like the UK and a lot of European countries, they can rely on a huge amount of wind energy. In Scotland, they have huge amount of wind. So I think it depends on the location.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question from the audience.
May I ask something?
Oh, okay.
The answer. Me as a researcher in energy storage, may I ask the user that why you said that we need the energy storage to support the unpredictable about wind or solar cell. So what should that the user need for a researcher to develop in the future?
Yeah, okay, Professor Ron Hui, why
Okay.
don't you take the question?
You need the battery to absorb the difference, instantaneous difference between power generation and the load demand. Okay, so this is the part that we have to absorb it. For research in energy storage, there are two aspects. One is the chemical aspect. The other is the control aspect. Okay, so if you are considering doing research in this direction, I think depending on your background, you can either choose the control aspect with the electronic control or the chemistry aspect to develop more powerful batteries.
Right. I will also ask Professor Whittingham to give us some advice on battery research. Please go ahead.
As I tell my students, don't work on what everybody else is working on. Work on something different. It may be risky, but you may make a breakthrough because there's a huge number of folks working on standard materials. Just try to do something different.
Right, okay. We have another question from the audience, Chen Ling. Can you put her online to ask a question?
Hi, Professor. This is from Hong Kong, and I would like to ask that for the small generation grades that are collected together that you just raised, what do you think that are the most important technical issues that need to be solved?
Okay, I would direct this to Professor Baliga.
So as I said earlier in my presentation, we worked on these technical issues for about 10 years at the Freedom Center and addressed many of these issues. That doesn't mean we solved all the problems. There are still improvements that can be made. But one of the difficulties in the activity was actually making semiconductor devices that can work at utility scale voltages. We're talking about 15,000 volts and even higher. And for most applications like electric cars and home appliances and so on, it's fine to have 1,000 volt capability or maybe a little more than that. So the industry right now is all focused on building those components because there are immediate markets. But for the future, if you want to do something at the utility level, we need to make devices at the much higher voltage level. The other unique thing about utilities is that it's an AC system. The power has voltage that goes in both directions. And that requires semiconductor devices that can work in two quadrants. With most power devices like MOSFETs are built to work only in one quadrant. So there is room for a lot of innovation, some of which we have already done, but much more room to create such new architectures. So if you're interested in working on semiconductor devices, there is still room to make some innovations. And the fact that the utilities are sort of slow in accepting this gives you time to do all this research and produce something that they can use in maybe 10 years.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Chen Ling, for the question. Yeah, you have another question to ask?
Yeah, yes. And I also want to ask that for the small generation grids, that except for the solar panels to be used as the power source, what do you think are the like energy resource that can be has a potential to supply power. Because for me, for example, for me, I'm researching in the energy area, and now I'm researching on like using the water, the droplets or the forge to try to generate electricity. Is there any other possibilities to like supply power for the to store energy in the batteries?
Okay. You're asking whether is solar going to be the dominant renewable, and you have to incorporate energy storage as part of the component. Are you asking that? Is that the question you're asking?
I'm asking the question that are there any other energy resource except for the like solar panels that also has potentials to supply the power in the future?
Right. So alternative renewable. Professor Ron Hui, you want to take that question?
Yeah. At the moment, I think wind and solar power are the two dominant renewable energy resources. Of course, you have hydropower, but again, it depends on the location. I think if you are working from Hong Kong, one of my colleagues in Hong Kong, they are exploring energy harvesting from the salinity between freshwater and seawater. Okay, so this may be another opportunity to harvest energy because there's an energy potential between seawater and freshwater. Okay, so this is one of the new area that my team, when I was in Hong Kong, that was one of the areas that we have been studying.
So for completeness, let me mention some more. One other way people are getting energy is through tidal systems, where water comes inland and leaves, and they get energy from the tidal wave. Another is called wave energy, where just from the waves in the water, they're able to extract the energy. So there are many, many ideas out there that people are making use of and having some success. If you need energy, a lot of energy for a longer time period, then you may want to think about storing water in high hilltops. So you can pump this water up and store it, and then recover that water when you need it and get back energy. So all these very interesting innovations are also being done.
Thank you, Stanley.
Thank you.
Professor Whittingham, please go ahead.
Yeah, we should not forget that clean form, cleanish anyway form that we're not going to get rid of quickly is nuclear energy. It does not generate CO2. And a lot of countries, including France, are dominantly nuclear. And I think New York State spending billions of dollars to keep their old plants still running. And that's a good baseline load when the sun isn't shining.
Okay, thank you. So Professor Baliga, I actually visited NC State some years ago, and I spoke to Subhashif, and I know you have excellent work in silicon carbide solid state transformer. But you said that the utilities are a little bit hesitant, and I believe that they are very concerned about reliability. What's the view on the reliability of silicon carbide MOSFET now?
So if you think the utilities are concerned about reliabilities, you should try to make a product for the motor car companies. They are paranoid about reliability and have always been. So if you want to introduce a silicon carbide based inverter for electric vehicles, reliability becomes the very first article of discussion with them. Of course, performance is taken for granted. If you don't have better performance, they're not going to even invite you to come and talk to them. But then cost also becomes the next item. So the industry has worked very diligently to address the reliability issues, and the companies feel that reliability is now under control for devices working at least up to about 3,000 volts. They are not pushing reliability testing at higher voltages because there's not much of a market for them to spend all that effort. But they feel they've done enough to produce sufficient reliability. And I guess one evidence of this is that Tesla has made an electric vehicle that is using silicon carbide MOSFETs in their drives. And that shows that they have some confidence about the reliability. And I've heard that Toyota is also doing this. So I think the reliability issue for silicon carbide has, the perspective has changed a lot in the last 3 or 4 years.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I realize that we are running out of time. So before I bring the panel discussion to a close, I would like to ask each one of you, what advice would you give to the young scientists to prepare for the grid of the future? We start with Professor Whittingham.
I think the world is open to them. Countries will listen, utilities will listen, politicians will listen. You have the opportunity yourself of defining what the grid of the future is. Even if it's just in your local housing environment, put a microgrid in a local village or something like that, and then build that up. But I think if it's smallish, you can probably get it going. But as you get bigger and bigger, you've got to involve the politicians, and it gets much more complicated. But I think as we've had hurricanes and fires, everybody's saying we want microgrids. So if the main utility goes down, we are still up and going. So the students, look at the opportunities out there, whether it's in the storage area or in the electronics. Do something that excites you. Don't do anything for the money, because in the end you won't like it. Do something that really gets you excited, and good luck. And some of us have made it. So it's possible.
Thank you. So do something that is exciting. Professor Baliga?
So I say amen to that. I, in fact, said some of the same comments during my discussion with the small group of scientists. So I think I advise all young people who come to me for some advice. They don't do that very often, but when they do, I advise them to find something they feel passionate about, do the proper homework to make sure that you feel your idea will work, and then try to convince people of the merit of the idea so that they can support you to make that come to fruition, to make it a reality. And I think that'll give you a lot of satisfaction. So I also say, don't do something purely for making money. I think you'll get more satisfaction if it has impact on humanity. Of course, it doesn't hurt if you make money along the way. That is always good.
Right. Yeah, okay. I say amen to that too. Professor Ron Hui?
Yeah, I think for the young audience, you have witnessed the adverse effects of extreme weather now. And I think spending your future in environmental research will be a highly meaningful career for you, and you will have no regret when you look back one day.
Thank you. Thank you for all the interesting discussion from the participant and from the panelists. I think we have a very good insight of what's going the next generation grid is going to be like. It's going to be distributed mesh of microgrid with lots of resilience, reliability, and also I think it will benefit the consumer and the producer in a sense that consumer could also produce energy. Then we call them as prosumer. So it's going to be a win-win situation from the user and also the consumer. So yes, we will look forward to the future grid and then let's have a win-win situation for the consumer and the producer. Thank you very much. It's been an interesting discussion, and thank you all of you for this interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you and welcome to this plenary session of the 10th anniversary edition of the GYSS. So this morning, we are very delighted and honored to welcome Sir Andre Geim to deliver his plenary lecture on random walk to graphene. So to many of us, Andre needs no special introduction on his groundbreaking achievement on graphene, which is a one atom thick two-dimensional material made out of graphene, made out of carbon, to which he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2010. Andre is now a Regius Professor at the University of Manchester, and through the years he's received numerous distinctions and accolades in various countries and institutions for his outstanding achievements and contributions to science. So apart from graphene, Andre is also well known in two other research fronts in pioneering them. Firstly, in diamagnetic levitation, and also secondly, in biomimicry of gecko-like materials, making him the recipient of the year 2000 Ig Nobel Prize, and also rendering him the first and only recipient of both the Nobel and Ig Nobel Prizes. A note here, though, to our audience that unfortunately Andre Geim can't be here with us physically or virtually today due to some unforeseen circumstances at the last minute. So there will not be any live Q&A, no live question and answer after the talk, but there will be an interactive a small group discussion with him tomorrow morning. So that's a chance for you to get some interactive Q&A with Sir Andre Geim tomorrow morning. Please take note of that. But nevertheless, let's please welcome Sir Andre Geim and his random walk to graphene.
Hello. When someone receives a big prize, especially such big prize as the Nobel Prize, there are always questions, and people usually ask how and why. How, what's the reason for that, and how did it happen, and why, for example, why this guy have received this prize, not myself. In this talk, I'm going to tell you the story behind and why graphene, what's so special about this material, why it deserves the Nobel Prize. About 30 years ago, I got my first permanent position as a professor at the University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands, and I didn't want to do, straightforward research, which we are all in academia are paid to do. I also wanted to do something for my soul, some educational, simple experiments, which I would enjoy doing at my free time. I have done quite a few of those experiments, and to give you an idea about those, they usually called Friday night experiments, I tell you about the first and one of the most famous experiments about magnetic levitation. So in the Netherlands, we had those huge magnets, electromagnets. They create quite a reasonable magnetic field of the order of 20 Tesla. It's several times higher than the magnetic field you would experience if you have MRI scan in a hospital. Unfortunately, they were very awkward to use, a lot of energy, only at night. Cooling water goes through to take all the heat out. So basically, frankly, we suffered to find out what kind of experiments could be done in those magnets. And those magnets were not unique at all. They existed probably for half a century in 10 or so places around the world. So once upon a time, I was thinking, okay, what can we do with those magnets? Why wouldn't I put water inside those magnets? Water is popular substance, and it seems no one tried to put water in such magnetic field. Maybe something happened. Apparently, no one asked this question before, and I really didn't know what to expect. So on Friday night, I took a bottle of water, switched the magnet on, and poured this water inside the magnet. I'm not sure what I expected, and certainly I didn't expect it what happened next. Instead, water going to the floor, as one normally would expect, somewhere here at this point, there was a tennis ball of water freely levitating in air. I shine laser light green in order to see it more clearly and blow some air, giving it some movement in order it would be clearly seen that it's a levitating water. Obviously, I didn't invent an anti-gravity machine. It took me several minutes to realize that the phenomena behind is quite well known. It's magnetism. We all possess so-called diamagnetism. If there is a magnet near us, we are repelled by this magnet, but we don't notice this because it's millions, thousand millions, billions times smaller than what we normally associate with magnetisms like iron, nails, or fridge magnets. So it's perceived, this diamagnetism, as extremely feeble phenomena, which requires really scientific environment to detect it. Turned out not to be true because numbers tell us that indeed, if put in this reasonably high magnetic field, it's enough to compensate the gravity by magnetism, and there is a special story why it levitates, not just repelled around. So next morning happened what I didn't expect at all. I told my colleagues, who some of them very senior, that I levitated water last night, and people say, yeah, you're pulling my leg. It's impossible. It's too small. So, and it continued for a week. Then I make a demonstration, obviously, first for a couple of people, then for another group of people and another. And then when people realize that it's really possible and actually beautiful to observe, people came around with all sorts of brilliant ideas what else could be levitated. And for months and months, people suggested me what else can we watch levitating in air. So it's really relaxing to see how levitation occurs. But eventually I got fed up with those demonstrations, so I decided to give it the last run and to find something which would really appeal to everyone, even to school kids. So I took a little frog and levitated it and make this photo of this frog, and even managed to make a short movie of a frog flying in there. So that was my final touch to this story. And these days, when I go to conferences, sometimes people stop me at those conferences and say, oh, I know you. No, I don't. I have no idea what graphene is, but your frog. When I start giving lectures about magnetism, I put the picture of your frog on my screen, and then students want to learn what it is. And sometimes I get nice letters still from kids around the world. This came from Alaska, saying that I'm 9 years old. I like to know how you got the frog to float, and I want to become a scientist. I think I rest my case of doing this simple educational experiment. And for example, I learned a few days ago that there is now a levitation facility in China where they try to mimic microgravity for their mission in 10, 20 years to the moon. Interesting how things develop. That was the very first experiment, and I have done quite a few of those. That's another example of this kind of experiments. I learned one day how geckos, and there are plenty of those in Singapore, how they climb walls and glass ceilings. It tend to be pretty straightforward mechanisms from the point of view of physics. Toes of geckos covered with tiny, tiny submicron hairs. When each hair touches the surface, there is a minute force, nanonewton force, so-called van der Waals force, which attracts this hair to the surface. But geckos learn how to attach all those geckos hairs simultaneously to, say, glass, and then billions of hairs working in unison with nanonewton force create quite a formidable force, enough to keep geckos on top of those ceilings. So then I said, wow, that's the same spatial size which we use in our lab, in my experiments. Why can't I mimic those hairs in biolithography? So about 15 years ago, with the help of my colleagues, I created this forest of tiny, tiny hairs to mimic gecko principle. I wanted to make a big glove and give it to a student and let student climb outside a window. There were no lack of students, but unfortunately all I could make, only a tiny piece of gecko hair, not enough for a glove, but enough to make at least a demonstration that this principle work. This has become a rather vibrant area of research. About 10 years ago, I have seen a real person hanging from a ceiling using this kind of glove. The problem is that the gloves, unlike real gecko hairs, becomes very quickly poisoned by dust or something else. They attach to each other, so it's not as attachable, detachable as in the real life. But people working on this, maybe one day it will have gecko gloves, but at least the idea has been demonstrated, and it was worthwhile to attract attention of colleagues to these gecko principle gloves. There were many different experiments in parallel with my main area of research, which I'm not going to tell you about. So about a few years after the gecko tape experiments, I came up with another random idea to try. I knew that there are big chunks of graphite, and they're widely used in experiments, all sorts of experiments. It's very popular material for atomic force microscopy, for any surface science technique, and we all know that it's very easy to peel layers of graphite from each other. So I asked myself a question: how thin we can make graphite? You know, ancient philosophers in Greece invented the concept of atoms. If you take a stone and split it in two pieces and then again, twice again, then eventually you might come to something which is no longer divisible. So I thought the same. Why we wouldn't make thinner and thinner pieces? How did we do it? Many different ways were tried, but one of those ways which eventually proved successful was to take just an ordinary Scotch tape, attach it to the surface of graphite and peel away some layers of graphite. This has been done a million times before us. People prepared clean surfaces of graphite using Scotch tape. I have done myself it quite a few times before in my career for various surface probe techniques. And we, myself, and thousands of my researchers for many decades before usually studied what is left on the surface, clean surface of graphite, and threw away the Scotch tape with rubbish on the top. That was a mistake. People didn't realize that together with the Scotch tape, they probably threw away their Nobel Prizes. So we took this Scotch tape and look in the microscope. And immediately the light comes from the back of the screen. It's on looking from the back, how much light goes through. This piece is dark, this is thick piece of graphite. Graphite is metal, it's not transparent, but then there are very thin pieces of graphite which are nearly they're transparent and highly transparent. Now, with benefit of hindsight, I know that it's probably about 10 atomic layers thick. It's extremely thin in this respect, about 3 nanometers thin. And that was eureka moment. I realized by this way we can make extremely thin pieces of graphite and study it, and no one has studied so thin graphite before. That was really something. Eventually, we went to thinner and thinner pieces obtained by this technique. It's still the Scotch technique is one of the dominant techniques to produce graphene these days, and people use it routinely, and we obtain very thin pieces of graphite. So what's the interest in this one? The main interest for me, why I was excited, because of the following. If you look around us, all objects in our universe are essentially three-dimensional. Height, length, width, those are inevitable attributes of any matter we have in the universe. There are no two-dimensional materials in our normal life, unless you forget about graphene. At least they were not known before. And the reason for this is quite simple. Everything which comes in as a matter, as materials, it comes from merger of individual atoms. In this case, we get carbon atoms and put them together at certain temperature to allow them to merge. And as you see from this movie, initially, they're quite happy to merge in kind of short, flat, or one-dimensional objects, but eventually everything becomes kind of three-dimensional architecture. This is because those vibrations are making low-dimensional structures are not stable. So what we have done in those experiments, apparently for the first time in our human civilization, not obviously in the whole universe, but in our civilization, we took a three-dimensional material which is grown according to all laws of nature, no problems with that. And then cool it down from very high temperature, which required to grow. And at low temperature, we extracted individual atomic plane. This was first graphene. And this is how graphene looked like. You can see it by a naked eye. It's a layer of carbon atoms. And there is no problem with this one because the temperature at which we extract it, it's much lower than the temperature at which material grew. So we took then all kinds of available characterization technique of modern science to prove that this material indeed monolayer, essentially a chicken wire of carbon atoms, which can be drawn like this one. And this is it. We prove that we can obtain two-dimensional materials by extracting individual atomic planes from bulk materials. If you look at this structure, it's an extremely simple structure. You think that nothing special would be about this structure. And if it would be just monolayer, stable at room temperature of carbon, I wouldn't be talking to you today. It would be a niche research, but we didn't stop by claiming that we can make two-dimensional materials. We start studying graphene, and graphene has proven to be a really wonderful material in many respects. Of course, it's the thinnest imaginable material, and because of that, it has the largest surface area you can imagine. Several football pitches can be covered with gram of this material. What we didn't expect, no one expected, that it's actually the strongest material ever measured. Of course, it's on nanoscale, but it's strong enough to survive environment, to live in air, to make membranes, and so on. Approaches the theoretical limit which is possible in our universe for strong materials. It's stiffer than diamond, but at the same time, it's stretchable and pliable, like a little bit rubber. It shows record thermal conductivity and it allows huge current through its cross-section, 1,000 times, millions actually times more than copper is capable to sustain per the same thickness at room temperature. It's completely impermeable to all atoms we know. And the list goes on and on and on, and people add more and more superlatives to this long list of graphene. The Nobel Prize was given not for the fact that we found a two-dimensional material, but for investigation of science, electronic properties of this material. Let me give you a very, in one transparency, a very basic idea of what's going on. Essentially, all metals, all materials we know around us, they're kind of, can be explained, semiconductors, metals can be explained by Schrödinger physics. It's quantum physics, but it's particles essentially moving like billiard balls or ballistic particles. If you are astrophysicist or particle physicist, then people use another equation, which is called Dirac equation, which describes a very fast particles which are moving close to the speed of light. And that's kind of two completely separate branches of physics. One studies non-relativistic phenomena, quantum or non-quantum, and another studies relativistic phenomena, which are usually quantum and close to the speed of light. What happened in graphene? Graphene has very special electrons which move in a way which mimics ultra-relativistic particles. So having graphene, we managed to do experiments which are not possible in other experiments, even at the highest energy accelerator in the world. So it's not exactly the same physics, but it's a very close mimicry of what happens in particle physics and near, for example, neutron stars. I'll give you a couple of examples. One example is what physics cannot be probed at CERN, but is routine actually. In case of graphene, it explains many of its wonderful electronic properties. It's a tunneling phenomena. You know, in our world, there is no tunneling. If you have your car and go at high speed into a brick wall, you know what's happening. If you live in a quantum world and have a car which would behave according to laws of this quantum world, then some of you know that there is so-called quantum tunneling. Part of the car goes through, another part of the car is reflected. But imagine that you live in a world the same, following the same laws as electrons in graphene follow. In this case, you try to build a barrier, however high or however wide you make this wall for a car behaving according to the physics of graphene electrons, you can't stop this car. It goes with 100% probability through those walls. And as I said, this Klein tunneling, a phenomena predicted 70 years ago, was not possible to observe in any accelerator built up today and probably in another 1,000 years, but we can mimic this phenomena in graphene quite easily and routinely. Another example how magic and wonderful this material is the following. I already mentioned that graphene, despite being only one atom thick, is impermeable for all gases and liquids, and many people demonstrated it. Most recently, we found the limit that even if you take helium and the lifetime of the universe through a reasonable area, say of square meter of graphene, there would be maybe 1-2 atoms passing through. So impermeable it is that nothing goes through, even over billions and billions years. So with this in mind, we had another close material. It's a lead material called graphene oxide laminates, but essentially it's many layers of graphene densely put on top of each other. And the reason why we wanted to use this material, because it's very easy to obtain. It's easy to make square meters of this material, while graphene itself very hard. So expectation was that if a single layer is very impermeable, then of course thousands of layers, and we make thin membranes like this one containing about 1,000 of layers graphene packed on top of each other, like in mother of pearls, you create a brick-like structure, the material would be also impermeable. And we sealed a bottle containing helium, and we found out that nothing goes through this membrane at all, as expected. And we tried many different gases, many different liquids, and nothing did go through until we tried water. Water turns out to evaporate very easily. In fact, if we heat water, then we could even see a steam naked going through. We changed water to helium and back and found out that it's vacuum tight. No gases can go through, but at the same time, when it's 100% humidity, water goes easily through. So it's an oxymoron of vacuum tight material, which at the same time super permeable to water vapor. I'll leave you wondering how it could be, because it looks like magic. It's not a magic. We know the explanation, but you can find it in this paper, for example, if you are interested, or on the web. My final example is another magic which graphene has delivered. You know, people were looking for philosopher's stone, something which turns lead or something else into gold for many centuries, and they were not successful. We were a bit successful in this respect. We didn't use lead, but we used electronic waste. Central processing unit or any kind of electronic waste can be exposed to aqua regia, a mixture of two acids which dissolve all metals, including gold. And then we filter this solution, which contains all sorts of salts, including gold salt, through graphene. And that's how it works. It's graphene here, and we pour inside this acid containing a lot of salts. And you see a graphene filter changes its color into golden, and then eventually it becomes completely golden color. The extraction is nearly 100% of gold, 99 point something percent of gold extracted from this circuit, and all other metals, all other salts which occur in this solution, they just go through without compromise. Then what is left here is heated up to 500 centigrades in air, and as a result, you get a bunch of gold grades. Literally, it works as simple as this. You extract gold from rubbish. It's a recent paper. We'll see how it will be taken by recycling industry, but we can easily do it in the lab. So with those two examples, I hope I persuaded you that graphene shows a cornucopia of unusual effects. I give you 3 examples. There are hundreds of those from other groups as well. Those were 3 examples from our own research, and I think graphene continues to bring more and more such an unusual phenomenon. My final slide is more philosophical. If you take a pencil and draw a line on paper, you know that there would be pieces of graphite inside. So if you have a microscope and you look carefully enough through these pencil trays, you, like myself, will eventually find that there would be pieces which are so thin that they're transparent and they're one atom thick. This is graphene. So literally and figuratively speaking, graphene was in front of our eyes and under our noses for many centuries, since pencils were invented and used. And we didn't know about that. That probably gives you an idea how little about the world we live in we still know. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
All right, that was a truly inspired and very inspiring talk by Andre Geim on the random walk to graphene. I think his Friday night experiments will resonate with many of us researchers in the audience as well. That those incidental discoveries that you make bore out of scientific curiosity or sometimes just pure luck. Yeah, that reminded me of my own experiences as well in my early days of PhD. My first project actually, where after 6 months of seemingly futile experiments, I made an accidental 10 times extra dilution of my stock materials, and then that led to some surprise successes in this type of solar cell device I was making. So anyway, so now we've heard about Andre's experiences, firstly in his levitation using diamagnetism, demonstrated first with water and then with fruits and then eventually even a frog. Although nowadays I suspect we might need a lot more ethical approvals for that to happen. And then moving on to his pioneering work in bio-inspired nanomaterials, the gecko-like gecko feet-like tapes and gloves. And to finally finding new signs in what's always been deemed as waste material, waste products, leading to the first 2D graphene materials discovered with so many impressive characteristics and properties. I'm sure many of our audience, including myself, have many burning questions for Andre about his very inspiring talk. But it's a pity that Andre isn't with us here today. But please be reminded that tomorrow there's an interactive session, a small group discussion with him. So that's our chance to ask some live questions to Andre. But regardless, I think I do hope that his talk, his lecture has left us with some interesting talking points for further discussions with our friends and colleagues after this. And most importantly, for our young, aspiring young scientists of GYSS audience, Andre's last slide definitely left us some food for thought. And that is, there is boundless and endless eureka moments around us, but they're still untapped and undiscovered, but we just need to keep looking for them. They're just right there under our noses. So lastly, thank you for the audience, and we thank Andre as well for the very lovely talk. And we certainly hope to see you and Andre in our other events in our next year's GYSS. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Young Scientist presentation session of the GYSS. Today, I'm happy to have three speakers at this session. And so the first one is Bing Lu. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the Singapore Center for 3D Printing at the Nanyang Technological University. And that is also where he got his PhD, where he completed his PhD. So for his research, he had gotten a commendation award before at the ACI AS Conference 2019 for his work on the development of sustainable 3D printable cementitious materials. And today he's going to tell us about how he can tackle the issue of the petroleum and oil refinery industry producing large amounts of fluid catalytic cracking ash by presenting a new method that can utilize this FCC ash as a partial replacement material of cement in these 3D printable concrete materials.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lu Bin, and currently I'm a research fellow at Singapore Center for 3D Printing, Nanyang Technological University. My presentation topic is Sustainable 3D Concrete Printing with Fluid Catalytic Cracking Ash, FCC ash. Firstly, let me introduce the background. Compared with other industries, such as the manufacturing, takes about 30% greenhouse gas emission, and 8% global greenhouse gas comes from the cement production. So this current situation of the productivity and carbon issues call for the revolution in the construction industry. And at the same time, we need to think about the alternative sustainable materials with less cement usage. On another front, crude oil refinery is a key industry in Singapore. A large amount of crude oil is processed every day, which generates tons of waste, including the FCC ash. Currently, the major waste treatment for FCC ash is landfill disposal, which creates issues to the living environment and also consumes the land resources. Hence, we need to source for the alternative waste treatment method for FCC ash. Can we use the FCC ash as a cement substitute? The answer is yes, because firstly, the FCC ash shares the similar chemical composition to the cement, and secondly, the FCC ash also possesses certain chemical reactivity so that it can be used in the early hydration of the cement. So the FCC ash can be applied as a cement substitute. Regarding the construction productivity we mentioned before, we bring the 3D concrete printing into the building and construction field. So as you can see in the figures, previously we used the conventional casting method, and after that we use the precast concrete technology to construct the structures. Now we use the 3D concrete printing. As you can see in these figures, the structures can be firstly printed in the factory and then assembled on site. Compared with conventional casting method and precast concrete, the 3D concrete printing provides benefits of less waste, less labor investment, and higher efficiency. Therefore, it is regarded as a key technology in the future smart city development. It is hence brought to our attention that whether we can use the FCC ash to develop our 3D printable concrete. If this is accessible, then it can be a win-win strategy for both construction industry and oil refinery industry. On the one hand, the cement usage is reduced, which leading to the better sustainability. On the other hand, it also provides an alternative waste treatment method for the oil refinery industry. So this drives the motivation of this study. Firstly, let's look at the printing setup. We can see that the printing system consists of two parts. One is the delivery part and the other is control part. In the actual printing, the material will be delivered from the pump through the hose to the nozzle, and the movement of the nozzle is controlled by the gantry so that it can move as per our designed program. This is the designed structure in our study. So each is a column with 500 millimeter height and 50 layers. So for the successful printable material, it should meet certain rheological requirements to have good pumpability and buildability. The material needs to be pumped easily from the pump through the hose to the nozzle, and after extruded from the nozzle, it should resist the gravity from upper layers, and the whole printed structure cannot have large deformation or even collapse. In addition to these specific rheological properties, we also require the material to have low toxicity because we know that the crude oil itself contains many heavy metals. So we need to check whether the toxicity meets our acceptance criteria if we introduce the FCC ash in our mixtures. The good pumpability is associated with the pumping pressure. So the pumping pressure can be controlled by many parameters such as Q, R, and L, the flow rate and the dimensions of the hose. However, the two controlling material factors are the dynamic yield stress and plastic viscosity. So if a material has low dynamic yield stress and low plastic viscosity, then the pumping pressure will be lower. This suggests that the material has a good pumpability. On the other hand, the material itself should also have good buildability so that the printed structure can be higher. So we can see that it is associated with the static yield stress. With a high static yield stress, the maximum printing height will be higher, which suggests that the material has good buildability. So we can see that when we increase the FCC ash substitution percentage, hereby we replace cement by FCC ash at 0%, 10%, and 20%. We also tried 30%, but if we replace 30% cement by the FCC ash, then it will cause the blockage because the static yield stress gets too high, and also it sets quite fast. So it hardens quite fast inside the hose. So we can see that the dynamic yield stress and path viscosity do not change too much with different FCC ash content. And the pumping pressure will also not change too much. Hence, it indicates that the pumpability is less influenced by the FCC ash content. However, with more FCC ash content, the buildability is significantly enhanced. The static yield stress and the evolution of the static yield stress are greatly improved. We can see that the black line stands for the minimum required static yield stress for the bottom layers. So with more layers, this value will be higher, and we can see that for the our control material, where there is no FCC ash, the static yield stress of the mixture is lower than the required value at 13th layer, and correspondingly, in the printing process, we can see that the printed structure shows a large deformation at 12 layers and finally collapse at 15th layer. However, for the developed material with FCC ash, hereby we replace 20% cement by FCC ash. The static yield stress is quite high, and it is always higher than the required value in the printing process, and the evolution of the static yield stress is quite obvious. And we can see that the structure can be printed very successfully without any noticeable deformation. It also passed the leaching test so that our developed material has very few leached trace heavy metals, and it has less heavy metal leachates than the raw FCC ash. To conclude, The partial replacement of cement by FCC ash does not have significant effect on pumpability. However, it greatly contributes to the static gear stress and its evolution. Hence, it greatly enhances the buildability. The developed material with FCC ash has superior printing performance, as we can see from the content content before. And the heavy metal contaminate is further immobilized in the developed material. The study brings the benefits to the construction industry and oil refinery industry in terms of smart construction, leaching improvement, and carbon emission reduction. It also provides an alternative waste treatment method for FCC ash. This is an acknowledgement for the study, and this is the reference list for this presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lu, for the very clear talk. Really lovely results on a promising solution for sustainable living in cities. Are there any questions? Okay, so I see that there's one from Dr. Ahmed over here. Thank you, Dr. Lu, for sharing your work. Is this technology applicable for RCC structures? And what should the maximum size of coarse aggregate be?
Okay, thanks for your question. I would say the technology is built for the 3D printable concrete, and for the maximum size of concrete coarse aggregate, actually it is limited to your printing system. In our system, it is about 2 millimeter of the size limitations, but if you use a large hose with a large nozzle, then this limitation will be lifted.
Okay, thank you. There's another question from Dr. Lawrence Tan. Do you find any difference in how brittle the material is with increasing concentrations of FCC ash?
Okay, actually we haven't conducted this check. I mean, usually for check whether this material is brittle or not, we can do the tensile test. You need actual tensile test to see its tensile capacity, but we haven't conducted this test. I think since we did not add fiber inside the matrix, and this is pure, this can be comparable to the concrete material, so it will be quite brittle. I would say the next step of the improvement can be adding the fibers to improve its tensile performance, so that it will not be so brittle.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? Oh, okay. Here's another one from Dr. Guo Ping Hu. Is the FCC ash toxic at all?
Okay. Since the FCC is a critical process in the oil refinery industry, so we know that the crude oil contains some heavy metals, and we did check the heavy metal levels of the FCC ash. So it did contain some heavy metals, but from our sample, the received FCC ash is not so toxic. And through our experiment, we find that our developed material with FCC ash can further enhance its safety. But I would say it's also a case to case. So I will say generally it's not so toxic, but our technology can make it much more safer.
That's great. Really looks very promising. Are there any other questions from the floor? Okay, if not, I have one. So far, Dr. Lu, you discussed pumpability and buildability with the FCC ash content. How about the load that the 3D printed material can bear for a given design? How would the weight of this load be expected to scale with the FCC ash content?
Okay. The key is the key is its fresh properties. So we can see that the material has a very high buildability, so that it can resist the gravity from upper layers, and so it under this experiment under these lab conditions, we can see that it can support many layers, and considering its a very short staying time, we believe it can also build even higher. And for the concrete strength, for the strength of the material, the long-term strength of the material, we also examined, and it is comparable to our common concrete materials. So I would say our designed material is a good is a good material for the 3D concrete printing, and also it provides an alternative solution for the waste treatment of FCC ash.
Okay, great. One last quick question from Dr. Ahmed. Considering the toxic nature of FCC ash, will it affect the long-term durability of concrete?
Okay. The toxic nature of the FCC ash is admitted, but as I just mentioned, its toxic level is greatly reduced compared with the raw FCC ash if we introduce this in our concrete structures. And actually, this level already meets the Singapore National Environment Agency's criteria. So if we do not use it in the concrete materials, then we just put it for landfill, it will generate more a safe hazard. So I think from both the durability of the concrete and the environment per aspect, I will say it is okay. But for the long-term experiment, we haven't conducted, but we think it should meet our requirement.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lu. I think this concludes this segment. Maybe we can have the next speaker, Disha.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lu.
Okay, for the second speaker, we have Disha Kapasi from the Australian National University, where she is a PhD student. And in particular, she is working with Professor David McClellan on technologies for future gravitational wave detectors. And today she's going to tell us about her work on presenting and characterizing a narrow line with an external cavity diode laser that works at 2-micron wavelength. Now, this is a low-cost, high-performance alternative to fiber lasers, and it could be incorporated into next-generation gravitational wave detectors. For her research, she has also worked before actually at the Caltech LIGO lab.
Hi, I'm Disha Kapasi, and I'm a PhD student from the Australian National University. And today I'll be talking about probing deeper into the gravitational universe using near-infrared lasers. About 100 years ago, Albert Einstein formulated the theory of general relativity, which predicts the existence of gravitational waves. These gravitational waves are perturbations in the fabric of space-time that come from catastrophic events like black hole mergers, neutron star mergers, supernova explosions, and so on. And these gravitational waves are expected to travel at the speed of light. What you see in this animation on your left-hand side is the response of a ring of free particles to a passing gravitational wave. As the wave passes in the z direction or perpendicular to this ring of particles, you can see that the particles itself compress and stretch in orthogonal directions. What we are trying to measure here are actually tiny length fluctuations, which is roughly 1,000,000 times smaller than the size of a proton, using an instrument called the Michelson interferometer. The animation now on your right-hand side will show what a typical gravitational wave observatory would look like. We have the laser that comes from one side and splits into two orthogonal directions in the X and Y arms, and the light propagates in this until it reaches the end mirror, reflects back, and recombines at the beam splitter. And the interference signal is now detected at the output port on a photodiode camera or a CCD. What you see at the output right now in this animation is a very exaggerated signal, whereas, like I said, what we measure is something really tiny. It's important to note that the laser here is our ruler, which helps us measure these length fluctuations, and hence the stability is an important criteria for the observatory. Here we discuss the different sources available in the gravitational wave spectrum. So starting from the millisecond band, sources that are there in the universe. At the far right, we have the milliseconds or kilohertz bandwidth, which comprises from compact binary in spirals from black holes and neutron stars to pulsars and supernovae, and they can be detected by our ground-based terrestrial interferometers. And as we go to the longer periods, we have the more massive objects, such as the supermassive black hole in spiral and mergers. And these supermassive black holes are the ones that reside at the center of our galaxy. And using different instruments such as radio pulsar timing arrays, space-based interferometers, and terrestrial interferometers, we can cover the entire gravitational wave spectrum. And it can complement all the information that we know from our traditional electromagnetic telescopes. Here, what we see is a sensitivity graph of different detectors. So on your left-hand side is the graph that compares all the detectors, some of them that are currently running and some that are proposed and are going to be built in the future. On the y-axis, we have it in units of strain noise per root hertz, where strain is a dimensionless quantity and is a ratio of the arm length fluctuations over the baseline of your detector, and the x-axis is in frequency. The way to read off this graph is lower the curve, better the sensitivity. We have current detectors such as Kagra, Advanced Virgo, and LIGO in the top three traces. And as we move to future detectors such as Cosmic Explorer 1 and 2 and Einstein Telescope, we have higher sensitivity, which means we look further out into the universe. And converting this into a horizon plot, which calculates in terms of the cosmological redshift, you can clearly see as we move from current detectors towards future detectors like Cosmic Explorer 1, 2, and the Einstein Telescope, we can cover almost all of the and neutron stars that we can see up to redshifts of 100. Hence, an enhanced detector performance will extend the horizon for gravitational wave observations. However, before moving on to better detectors, we need to prototype and demonstrate technologies. And some of them are silicon mirrors, better coatings, cryogenics, monolithic silicon suspensions, high-powered lasers, quantum noise suppression, and new laser wavelength. I work on multiple technologies, but today we'll talk about a new laser wavelength. Some of the future detectors are expected to operate at the 2-micron wavelength. Currently, we don't have a reliable low noise source at 2-micron wavelength for which we can prototype all the other technologies. Hence, a stable source will help us demonstrate technologies into coatings, photodiodes, quantum noise suppression. And from the various laser configurations, we have chosen the external cavity diode laser for its simplicity and high performance, and it can be made easily from commercially available products. So what you can see over here on your right is the 2-micron external cavity diode laser that has been built at the Australian National University, and below is the paper that summarizes all the results from this. Moving on, we have the design of the ECDL. Like I said, it's a very simple and compact design, and it comprises of very few components. The first one is the gain chip. So the gain chip is the active medium in which the laser transition is pumped and the light comes out, which is then followed by a lens that helps collimating the beam and directs it towards the diffraction grating. The diffraction grating is a wavelength tuning element, and it is aligned in a litro configuration where the first order diffracted light is retro-reflected towards the laser. And by tuning, one can tune the wavelength of the laser. And we last have the piezoelectric transducer, which converts an electrical signal into a displacement, and hence by changing the grating angle, we can change the wavelength. This entire assembly is very compact, and then the laser performance of this entire ECDL is measured using an unbalanced interferometer. The first result that I would like to discuss is the relative intensity noise. So relative intensity noise is the fluctuations in the intensity of light itself normalized over its average power. This graph here has on y-axis RIN in units of 1 per root hertz, which is the amplitude spectral density, and on x-axis we have frequency. It compares two lasers, the ECDL that I have built, which is the lavender trace, and it compares that to a commercial fiber laser, which is the red trace. As you can see, over the entire frequency span, the ECDL has superior performance to the fiber laser. However, it's important to note that this measurement is limited by the dark noise of the photodiode, which highlights that a stable low-cost 2-micron source, such as our ECDL, would help R&D into, it will help people to make better photodiodes and do R&D into such a field. The next one I would like to discuss is the frequency noise. And the frequency noise refers to the random fluctuations in the instantaneous frequency of an oscillating signal. As you can see over here, I've again made a comparison between the commercial available fiber laser to our ECDL. At all frequencies above 200 Hertz, the ECDL has a superior performance compared to the fiber laser. And at frequencies over 3 kilohertz, the frequency noise of the ECDL is at 15 Hertz per root Hertz. We also have a special line on this plot, which is the gray dash starred line, which is the standard NPRO line, where NPRO stands for non-planar ring oscillator. This laser is the workhorse of a gravitational wave interferometer and is the best low noise laser developed up till now. And as you can see, comparing the ECDL to this standard laser, we have comparable performance up to 1 kilohertz. Some of the highlights of this work. Currently, the 2-micron ECDL is the only high performance and low cost laser that can be used in this gravitational wave research. And with such a laser, we can actually help accelerate R&D into 2-micron technologies, photodiodes, quantum noise suppressions, and coatings, all of which are active areas for the future detectors. The ECDL has a low optical power at its output. Hence, with collaboration from University of Adelaide, we are building a preamplifier to account for this. LIGO groups across Adelaide, Caltech, University of Glasgow, and Cardiff have been collaborating to build their own unit for their research labs. Lastly, this laser also finds application in medicine, gas sensing, metrology, defense, LiDAR, and many other fields. And I will leave you with my acknowledgements, and I would like to thank all my colleagues and friends who've been helping me throughout. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Disha, for your lovely talk. Absolutely beautiful slides. And I really enjoyed the animations of the gravitational waves and the interferometer.
Thank you
any
so
questions? Any questions from the floor, please? Okay, maybe I'll just start off with some questions. So you had mentioned in your talk, Disha, that some of the future detectors are expected to work at the 2-micron wavelength. So what do the current detectors work at, and why the move to 2 microns?
Excellent question. So the current detectors operate at 1064 nanometers or 1 micron. And the mirrors at the end of the interferometers, if you've noticed in the animation, they're test mirrors, and they're currently made of fused silica, which is like our glass. But future detectors are meant to be operated at cryogenic temperatures. Now, if you cool down glass and go to cryogenic temperatures, the inherent noise in the material itself is much higher, and you want all the noise to be as low as possible. So in future detectors, we're transiting from fused silica to silicon optics. And now if you're changing the material of your test mass itself, you need a laser that can transmit and to that wavelength. That means the reflectivity and the transmittivity of your coatings in that mirror should be suitable to the laser, which is your ruler in this case. So hence the shift towards longer wavelengths.
I see. So it's a general longer wavelength. shift. Then a follow-up question. In this case, why 2 microns and not something longer?
So 2 micron, because at around 2 micron, silicon has the highest like reflectivity from the mirrors. And also because around the 2 micron region, you have a lot of absorption in the water particles, but you also have narrow bands between these absorption lines wherein you can tune your laser. So it's not exactly 2 micron, it can be 1984 or 1990, but where there is a transmission gap between the absorption molecules, you can use the 2 micron laser over there because it's ground based, so there's water in the atmosphere and not everything is in the vacuum tube. Some optics are outside of the vacuum tank itself. So you need the wavelength that is not absorbed by the atmosphere itself.
Okay, thanks for the very clear explanation. A question from Dr. Bolut. A naive question. Why is it so important to better understand cosmic waves? What role does it play in the universe?
So all the detections we've made so far are from electromagnetic telescopes, which come from the infrared band, optical band, and go all the way to X-rays and ultraviolet rays. But gravitational waves encodes different kinds of information that we've not yet seen. So, for example, when we've never seen actual black hole mergers from electromagnetic telescopes, but we can sense them through gravitational waves, and that gives us a lot of information about the material and put constraints on different theories that are out there. So when we make detections, we don't only just test GR, but we also test alternative theories about cosmic strings and ultralight boson particles and see what works best. And this is what is important. And we use gravitational waves to study.
Okay, great. A question from Dr. Ayan. What is the next exciting event in gravitational wave detection? We've already seen neutron-neutron star and black hole collisions. What is next?
Very exciting, I think, for me would be to see a supernova explosion because we've not yet seen that. So we've seen black hole mergers, neutron star mergers, and recently last year we've detected 2 black hole neutron star mergers as well. But it will be absolutely exciting to see supernova explosions and also detecting a black hole neutron star merger with some electromagnetic counterparts. I think that's very exciting.
Okay, great. Any more questions from the floor? If not, maybe I have one last quick question. So in terms of, you compared fiber laser versus ECDR versus Nd:YAG, and your laser is really impressive in terms of the frequency noise and RIN. How low is good enough, actually? Are your specifications really good enough? Do you foresee trying to improve it? And how much power do you need?
So actual gravitational wave detectors in their arm cavities have powers up to like, I think 700 megawatts or sorry, 3 megawatts or something in the arm cavities. So what I built is a very low noise laser, which has an output power of only about 10 milliwatts. But we use that simple laser as the seed laser to put in amplifiers that can amplify to higher powers. But of course, as I said, like the noise is very important for us because the laser is our ruler. So the better is always good. And in terms of frequency noise, we want to see if we can make it much better as well. So at low frequencies, we're able to compare it with the standard NPROs and the Nd:YAGs. But at high frequencies, we do still need that improvement. So there is still work to be done.
Okay, but very exciting progress. Thank you very much, Disha. And
thank you
thanks
so
everyone
much
for your questions.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Okay, let's have the next speaker, please.
Okay, for our third speaker, we are pleased to have Sambit Panda. He's a PhD student from Johns Hopkins University, and that is also where he got his master's in biomedical engineering. And before that, he was an undergraduate at the North Carolina State University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Today, he will tell us actually about his new work on decision forests, where he has developed methods that actually have higher testing capabilities compared to existing methods.
Hi, my name is Sambit Panda, and I'd like to thank the Global Young Scientist Symposium for allowing me to talk today about paper I wrote called Non-Parametric MANOVA via Independence Testing. So the real motivation behind this talk was to really understand, this paper was to understand the relationship between K groups. So control versus disease patient is a real common population, it's a real common test. So we'd like to ask, are these groups related? And is a more difficult problem into, but are they related is definitely an important issue to think about. A little bit of background about statistics. Basically, we X to be some kind of random variable, which is some measurement. And then we're considering fx as the distribution of x. So basically, we denote that x is sampled from some distribution fx. In terms of hypothesis testing, kind of an informal intro is basically that the null hypothesis is some conventional belief about the phenomena of interest, and we denote that as H naught. Hypothesis about the same phenomena is HA. When we test, we try to reject the null hypothesis. And then U is a measure of confidence of our results that we get from our test. And so under a called alpha, we will reject the p-value, and that's in turn essentially rejecting the null hypothesis. Probability of observing a measurement more extreme than a given observation. So intuition behind our basically, when we want a testing procedure, we want one that works well in low and high dimensional data. Especially important now because a lot of data in science is very high dimensional. We'd like it to work on structured data like images and networks. And then we'd like it to work with linear and nonlinear relationships and be able to distinguish both. And then we'd like to have one that is very computationally efficient. So going back to our motivation in the beginning, we used this to answer a question whether the groups are related. So multivariate ANOVA or MANOVA is a really common standard of currently. And so at the top here shows basically how one of the test statistics is computed, but essentially data is derived. It has a couple of assumptions that it makes, one of which is that the data is multivariate Gaussian distribution, and that each group that you're testing has the same covariance matrix. And these are very strong assumptions, not very present in data that I'm sure many of you use. So there has to be some better test out there that doesn't make these strong assumptions. So before I go into our to talk a little bit. So basically when we're doing impedance testing, we're given two random variables x and y, and they are independent if neither contains information about the other. So essentially we're seeing if their joint distribution, if we can separate their joint distribution fxy into their marginal distributions, which is fx and fy. When we're testing, that's our null hypothesis, and our alternative hypothesis is that fxy are not independent. So one test that we've developed in our lab is called multi-scale graph correlation. Basically, it computes this decoy test statistic whose math is shown at the bottom here at various values, and then it finds a smoothed max of the as the test statistic. Then it uses test, which is a non-parametric way of finding the p-value. Great. So now we have all of this stuff. What can we do with it? So basically what we're planning on doing is to reduce this case sample testing problem described before into the independence testing problem. Actually, how we do that is we basically concatenate our inputs into X. You want our inputs are U1 to UK, and they're concatenated into X. And we created a label matrix called Y that basically one-hot encodes everything in X. And we can run any independence test that we want, magic included. So this is a great framework because we don't to the like the actual test that we're using. So it's great. Okay, so how does it work in practice? So before I introduce our simulations, there's some two terms. Power is basically the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when the alternative is true. And relative power, in our case, is the power of a given approach minus a reference approach. And in this case, our reference is MANOVA for our figures. So first, we wanted to look at the optimal settings for which so we have three different Gaussians. So first, where all the means are the same. The second, where one of the means is different. And the third, where all three of the means are different from one another. And we see that our tests perform about as well as MANOVA does as we increase the separation of the clusters. Next, when we look at keeping the separation, increasing the dimensionality of our simulations, we see the real power of our test. We outperform MANOVA at high dimensions, so perform as well or better than MANOVA. And because of singular matrices issues with MANOVA, we are able to perform at higher dimensions indicated by the dotted line. Next, we wanted to look at not just Gaussians, but distributions that are used in the machine learning literature for tests. So we looked at each of these and we just took one sample and then rotated it twice to get two other samples. So here we show our relative power curves relative to MANOVA. So anything above 0 is better than MANOVA. Anything below 0 is worse than MANOVA. And we see as we increase sample size and fixed angle and dimension, we perform well in many cases. When we increase dimension instead, we see that for many we outperform MANOVA. We look at increasing the angle while fixing the sample size and dimension, and we see once again we perform better than MANOVA in many of the cases. Next, we can extend our work that we described before into performing multi-way and the multi-level tests. So multi-way tests are basically just using more than one treatment group. So instead of one hot encoding, we would have more ones basically in our label matrix. Kind of looks what it looks like. So on the left is the basic comparison between distance matrix and multi-way distance matrix. Then in B, we show a strong multi-way effect. So weak in the sense that the top Gaussian is equidistant from the other two Gaussians, but we distance between the other two Gaussians. And we see that our multi-way performs worse at low multi-way effects, but about as good effects. And if we look at a strong multi-way effect and increase the dimension, we see that our algorithm outperforms. Then level tests. So basically, we're looking at block permutation. So it's a little difficult concept. So I thought I'd show an animation basically. So if we sample from these two balls from these two boxes, where the left two values must come from the left box and the right two must we get a valid sample using this. But if we were to just considering which boxes each came from, we would get an invalid test. That's what we show here. So the null basically is we're looking at 100 points sampled from Gaussian, and then we sampled 2 points from each of those Gaussians. And as you can see here, just normal decor is invalid in this case, while our multi-level decor is not. And then lastly, we looked showing a real data example of using our test in practice. And basically using our multi-level and multi-way test, we were able to find that the third embedding in this case shows basically shown that there's several new tests that actually already existed using our framework that perform better than MANOVA, as well or better than MANOVA, that our multi-way tests can give it when there's a strong multi-way effect suspected, and then we show that we can also to use multi-level tests. So next steps, you can find this code in my Hippo package that I wrote. Install tutorials are linked there, as well as the paper for this work, and at the bottom are links. And then I'd like to acknowledge all the co-authors on this paper as listed here. So, any questions?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sambit Panda, for a lovely talk. Are there any questions from the floor? Okay, maybe I'll just ask a warm-up question first. So Sambit, you are based at the Biomedical Engineering Department. So what are some of the first applications of these computational tests that you've developed?
So we've analyzed, our lab is in particular looks at MRI, particularly structural MRI. And so we've taken subjects, I think I might have mentioned it briefly in the talk, but we analyzed patient meditators, expert meditators, and novice meditators, and they had different states, and we performed a multi-level test to see if we could find a low-dimensional representation of the MRI that offers some difference between expert and novice meditators. So that was one direct application we did. But honestly, we do a lot of connectomics research. So particularly taking a MRI, converting it into a graph, and then performing graph statistics is basically the main avenues that we've been looking. But I think this work can apply to many other fields. Just haven't
I
explored
see.
them yet.
Okay, so if you were to step out and have, sort of the one problem you wanted to solve with this test, what would it be?
Well, we're actually looking at a few new. We have a few new collaborations with some nonprofits. One in particular that I'm working with is Child Mind Institute, and we're trying to correlate brain states while watching a movie, and we're trying to correlate that with an MRI. And I think this test and some of the independence tests that we're also developing might help answer some of those questions.
I see.
about
So
how
a
they're
lot
related.
of it is centered around MRI, is what it
A lot
sounds
of
like.
our work is really centered around imaging and neuroscience. So those are the things I'm passionate about. So those are the problems I'd like to work on. But I think like it can be applied to like genomics, I'm pretty sure also. So just any multimodal data really, or multidimensional data.
Okay, awesome. That's actually really, really exciting.
Thank you.
Okay, a follow-up question from me. So, what do you think are the other problems that need to be solved to scale this up more widely? So I imagine you might have a whole deluge of many MRI images and things like that. Are there any other barriers to adopting this more widely?
Well, first, I guess knowledge of the tests. A lot of the independence tests that we're doing are new and need to be more, I think, widely adopted, since they are, while they are being used by some people in the machine learning community, when it comes to like some of the basic sciences like biology and chemistry. I mean, I used to work in a lab doing chemistry, and we really did we didn't do, I guess, like the most data analysis I guess we did was an ANOVA test, and I think that providing at least an alternative to that could be really beneficial, especially because ANOVA has a lot of issues when it comes to some of the assumptions that it makes. I mean, in terms of, it's kind of really a little difficult question to answer because I think the applications, I could come up with a lot of different ideas if I wanted to dream, I guess. But
Okay, but that's great.
yeah, it's a little difficult, I think, to come up with a few on the spot. But I think the application is very wide reaching.
Okay. Any questions from the floor? Okay, so maybe one last question from me. So instead of just throwing out different applications, going deeper into what you've done, what are some of your future plans to further develop what you've already worked on?
So yeah, so well, obviously my first plan is to publish this, and once I find the journal, I think our plans are basically applying this, extending this to paired K-sample tests. That's something we haven't been able to do with our framework yet. Basically, we are also planning on, we're developing a new independence test based on random forest and mutual information, which could offer a more powerful test that operates really well on high dimensional data. And so I would probably try to take that test, obviously fit it within our framework, and see if we can get a really powerful finite sample K-sample test that operates really well on high dimensional data. And I think that would be really beneficial to the MRI community especially.
Okay, awesome. Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much, Sambit, and let's
Yeah,
thank all of the
thank you.
speakers and everyone for their participation in this session.